In 1940, the German generals laughed. To them, war was a contest of steel giants, tanks, artillery, and armored divisions crushing everything in their path. When they first saw the little American Jeep, small, open-topped, and barely armored, they smirked. One German officer scoffed that, "It looks like a toy. One shell, and it's gone." They weren't wrong. The Jeep had no armor, no heavy guns, no glory. And yet, as the war dragged on, those same generals would stop laughing, because what they underestimated was not the Jeep's firepower, but its sheer ubiquity. By 1945, nearly 650,000 Jeeps rolled across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. They weren't just vehicles, they were lifelines. They carried generals to command posts, wounded soldiers from battlefields, messages under fire, and supplies across terrain no truck could reach. For the men on the front, the Jeep wasn't a toy, it was survival. And as the German war machine faltered, it was these tiny workhorses that helped grind it down. This is the story of how a machine once dismissed with laughter became one of the most important weapons of World War II, not through destruction, but through resilience, ingenuity, and presence in every theater of war. And it begins, not on the battlefield, but in an American factory, where engineers raced to design a vehicle the army barely believed it needed. In the 1930s, the United States Army was still thinking in terms of the past. Horses were still being used for reconnaissance. Trucks were bulky, slow, and unsuited for rugged terrain. The Army needed something nimble, a light vehicle that could scout, deliver messages, and adapt to the chaos of modern warfare. But in 1940, America was not yet at war. The Army was small, underfunded, and skeptical of radical new designs. When the call went out for proposals, it sounded almost impossible. A four-wheel drive reconnaissance car, less than 1,300 pounds, capable of carrying 3 soldiers, a machine gun, and equipment, strong enough to tow light artillery, cheap, fast to build, and durable. Only 2 companies took the challenge seriously. American Bantam Car Company, a tiny firm on the brink of bankruptcy, and Willys Overland, a struggling automaker desperate for survival. Bantam delivered the first prototype in just 49 days. Army testers drove it hard across punishing terrain, splashing through rivers, climbing steep hills, and grinding through mud. It wasn't perfect, but it was revolutionary. Yet politics intervened. Bantam was too small to mass produce, so the Army passed the design to Willys and Ford. Engineers refined it. Stronger engines, sturdier frames, easier assembly. By late 1941, the Willys MB and Ford GPW, the classic Jeep design, were rolling off assembly lines in the thousands. The Jeep was born, a machine not of prestige but of necessity. Simple, tough, fixable in the field with a wrench and a hammer. The men who first drove them in training camps joked it was like a mechanical mule, stubborn, rugged, and ready to go anywhere. But no one could yet imagine how far these little machines would go, or how they would become a symbol of American ingenuity itself. Because within weeks, the United States would be at war, and the Jeep SEP's true test was about to begin. To understand why the Jeep mattered, we must step away from generals and factories and look at the soldiers whose lives it carried. Private James McClure, a farm boy from Iowa, wrote home in 1942 from North Africa. "Theda, we call it, our chariot. It rattles, it bucks, it feels like it will fly apart, but it takes us everywhere. When the sun bakes the ground, it never quits. When the rains turn roads to rivers, it claws its way through. I swear the Jeep works harder than any of us." 6. For infantrymen, the Jeep was more than transport. It was mobility in a war defined by speed and unpredictability. One moment it ferried ammo crates. The next it hauled wounded comrades from fire-swept fields. Captain Robert Thompson remembered how his Jeep saved his unit during a German counterattack in Tunisia. By WWII, we were cut off. Radios down. Ammunition low. I sent 2 men in the Jeep across 3 miles of open desert under fire. They came back with supplies and reinforcements. That Jeep did what no man could have done on foot. But it wasn't only American soldiers. British and Commonwealth troops quickly embraced the Jeep. In the Western Desert, the legendary long-range desert group stripped down Jeeps, bristled them with machine guns, and turned them into raiding vehicles, striking deep behind Rommel's lines. Even generals relied on them. General Eisenhower would later say, "Tulsa the Jeep, the Dakota, and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war." From privates to supreme commanders, the Jeep became a trusted companion. Soldiers decorated them with names, painted pin-ups on their hoods, and treated them almost like living comrades. One GI joked, "The Jeep is the only thing in this war that complains less than a soldier and eats less than a mule." But as beloved as they were, the Jeeps were about to be tested under fire in some of the harshest conditions of the war, because by late 1942, the US Army was heading into its first real trial against Hitler's forces, and these little vehicles would have to prove their worth on a battlefield where German panzers still ruled. In North Africa, the Jeep met its first great trial, against Rommel's Afrika Korps, masters of armored warfare. These small machines looked laughably fragile. German officers sneered at the sight of open-top Jeeps darting across the battlefield. To them, war was decided by tanks and artillery, not flimsy scout cars. But the desert had its own rules. Tanks bogged down in sand dunes. Heavy trucks snapped axles on rocky ground, and here the Jeep shined. Its light frame skimmed over soft ground where larger vehicles sank. It could sneak supplies across dunes, deliver critical orders when radios failed, and carry wounded back across deadly terrain. Rommel's men learned to respect, even fear, the Jeep in the hands of the long-range desert group. These raiders, operating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, stripped their Jeeps down, mounted twin machine guns, and struck deep at German airfields. Under the cover of night, they would storm out of the dunes, guns blazing, then vanish before dawn. Corporal Harold Mason recalled in his diary, "Tangier, the Jeep was our life. We carried petrol cans strapped to every inch, water, spare tires, weapons. It felt like we lived in those machines. Without them, there would have been no raids, no survival." But the Jeep's true proving ground lay ahead. In 1943, Allied armies stormed Sicily, then Italy. Mountainous terrain, shattered roads, and muddy valleys made supply nearly impossible. Yet Jeeps clawed their way up goat tracks, hauled munitions through bombed-out towns, and ferried commanders up to the front lines. German generals still underestimated them. One Wehrmacht report dismissed the Jeep as unsuitable for prolonged combat use. But while German staff clung to rigid doctrine, Allied commanders embraced flexibility. They discovered that the Jeep could be anything: a messenger, an ambulance, a gun platform, even a mule that hauled artillery into places no truck could reach. By the time the Allies crossed into mainland Europe, the Jeep had become indispensable. For every division, every campaign, there seemed to be an endless line of these little machines, rolling forward no matter the conditions. And the laughter of German generals began to fade, replaced by frustration. Because the more they advanced, the more Jeeps they saw, until it seemed as if the American army had an endless supply of them. But in Europe, the war would grow darker, harsher, and bloodier, and for the Jeep, its role was about to become even more vital, as the Allies prepared for the greatest invasion in history, D-Day. Normandy was not a place for fragile machines. It was a crucible of fire and steel. The beaches were littered with obstacles, mines, and the shattered wrecks of vehicles that never made it off the sand. Among the men storming ashore were hundreds of Jeeps, crammed into landing craft, bouncing and sliding as they lurched toward the coast. Some never made it. Waves swallowed them whole. Others were torn apart by artillery the moment their ramps dropped. But the ones that did land, battered, waterlogged, yet still running, became lifelines in the chaos. Jeeps ferried ammunition across beaches choked with bodies and craters. They hauled the wounded to medics under fire. They carried engineers forward to clear obstacles before the next wave arrived. Lieutenant George Walker remembered, "Foda, there were moments I thought the beach would break us. The Jeeps seemed so small against the noise and fury, but when you saw one claw its way up the sand, weaving through wreckage, it was like watching hope itself move forward." Yet Normandy was only the beginning of the Jeep's trial. Beyond the beaches lay the hedgerows, thick earthen walls that turned every field into a fortress. Tanks could barely maneuver, heavy trucks bogged down, supply lines threatened to collapse. And so, once again, it fell to the Jeep. Light, nimble, adaptable. Soldiers welded iron teeth to their bumpers, turning them into makeshift hedgerow cutters. With these, Jeeps sliced paths through the bocage, guiding infantry and armor forward yard by yard. But the struggle was brutal. German ambushes shredded convoys, mines tore apart vehicles. Drivers learned to live with constant fear. In one unit, it was said the Jeep was the bravest soldier of them all because it went first, down roads that might be mined, through fields that might be watched. By late summer of 1944, the Allies had clawed their way out of Normandy, but at a staggering cost. Thousands of lives lost, countless vehicles destroyed, yet the Jeeps kept moving, rebuilt, replaced, sent forward again and again. For the men who survived, the laughter of the Germans seemed cruelly distant, because on the ground, no one was laughing. The Jeep was no longer a toy. It was the thread stitching together an army fighting its way across Europe. But the war was far from over. Ahead lay the Ardennes and the bitter winter of 1944, where the Jeep would face its hardest trial yet. The winter of 1944 was merciless. The Ardennes froze solid, and with it, the war itself. On December 16th, Hitler launched his last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. German tanks and infantry surged through the snow, smashing thin American lines. Entire units were cut off, encircled, or overrun. In these desperate weeks, the Jeep became more than a vehicle. It was the artery of survival. Roads were choked with ice. Fuel was scarce. Tanks stalled in frozen ditches. But Jeeps kept moving. They delivered ammunition through blizzards, carried commanders through collapsing fronts, and evacuated the wounded when ambulances could not pass. Private Richard Cowan later recalled, "We were trapped near Bastogne. The snow was waist-high. We thought no one could reach us. Then out of the white came two Jeeps, chains on their tires, ploughing forward like beasts. They brought us food, ammo and hope. Without them, we wouldn't have lasted." At Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, General Anthony McAuliffe's 101st Airborne relied on a handful of Jeeps to shuttle supplies between foxholes, often under direct artillery fire. One medic's Jeep was hit 3 times, yet patched together. It rolled again, still ferrying wounded out under shell fire. Even the Germans noticed. Reports from Wehrmacht units complained of the Allies' uncanny ability to stay mobile despite impossible terrain. One officer wrote bitterly, "The American Jeep is everywhere. Like a swarm of ants, it appears where no vehicle should go." The turning point came not in a single heroic charge, but in countless acts of endurance. Every Jeep that carried a radio operator through snow, every stretcher loaded on a hood, every crate of ammunition jolted over frozen ruts, each became a thread in the larger fabric of resistance. By January 1945, the German offensive had stalled. The bulge in the Allied line began to shrink, and when the weather finally cleared, Allied armor and aircraft surged forward again, supplied in no small part by the little machines that had refused to quit. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last great offensive. Its failure marked the beginning of the end, and through it all, the Jeep had proven itself not only useful, but indispensable, a symbol of resilience in the harshest conditions of the war. Now, with momentum regained, the Allies would unleash a relentless push into the heart of Germany, and once again, wherever the armies went, the Jeeps led the way. By spring of 1945, the Allies were ready to cross into Germany itself. The war's final act demanded speed, coordination, and relentless pressure, and once again, the Jeep became the thread binding the vast Allied war machine together. Where tanks spearheaded assaults, Jeeps scouted ahead, weaving through rubble-strewn roads to find passages. Where bridges collapsed under German demolition, Jeeps forded streams, or were hoisted across rivers on pontoons. They darted between advancing columns, carrying messages when radios faltered, hauling ammunition to frontline units, and rushing wounded back before the next wave pushed forward. At Remagen, where the Allies captured the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine, jeeps poured across in the first desperate hours, ferrying engineers, medics, and infantry reinforcements before the bridge collapsed. Survivors recalled that without the speed of the jeeps, the fragile bridgehead might not have held. One German prisoner later admitted, "For me it seemed, like every time we knocked out a road, the Americans already had their small cars driving around it. We could never stop them." Spit. The jeep's versatility reached its peak in these months. Some were fitted with radios, turning them into mobile command posts. Others were armored with makeshift steel plates, bristling with machine guns for patrol duty. Engineers strapped bazookas to their sides, medics bolted stretchers to their frames. In one unit, a chaplain even used his jeep as a mobile pulpit, holding services on its hood for exhausted troops. General George S. Patton, always hungry for speed, pushed his Third Army forward at a breathtaking pace, fueled by logistics that depended on the jeep. Supply officers marveled that no matter how broken the roads, these little machines kept the arteries of war pumping. This was not the war the Germans had planned for. Their mighty panzers had been built for decisive battles, not to chase an army that seemed endlessly mobile, and behind that mobility, humming tirelessly, was the unglamorous jeep. But as Allied forces surged east, the final collapse of the Reich drew near, and in those last desperate days, the jeep would not only carry soldiers to victory, it would also bear witness to the war's deepest tragedies. The Reich was crumbling, its armies shattered, its cities burning, its leaders hiding in bunkers. Yet the fighting did not stop. Fanatical resistance met the Allies at every river, every town. And through it all, the jeep was there. On the roads to Cologne, Nuremberg, Munich, Berlin, they carried officers directing the advance, engineers clearing paths, medics rushing into towns littered with booby traps and sniper fire. But the jeep also bore witness to scenes far darker. In April, Allied forces liberated the first of the concentration camps, Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau. Jeeps rolled through the gates carrying stunned soldiers who confronted the scale of horror. Prisoners, skeletal, hollow-eyed, clung to jeeps as they were ferried to safety. For many survivors, that small green machine was the first symbol that freedom had arrived. Private Samuel Bernstein wrote in his diary at Dachau, "The jeep seemed out of place among so much death. Yet when we drove in, the prisoners cheered. Some tried to touch the hood, as if to make sure we were real. I shall never forget their faces." Bulge. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Soviet and American forces pressed from opposite directions. Jeeps raced ahead of convoys, scouting ruined highways, linking units, and carrying messengers through streets where rubble made radios useless. When news spread of Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, it was often by word of mouth, carried between commands by officers bouncing in jeeps. And in early May, when Germany finally surrendered, jeeps formed part of the Allied columns entering cities where swastikas had flown just days before. General Eisenhower later reflected, "The jeep was as vital to our success as any weapon. It carried men through fire, through snow, through mud, through hell itself, and it never failed us." The laughter of German generals in 1940 had long since vanished. In its place was disbelief that something so small, so unassuming, could have been everywhere, carrying an army on its back until the very end. The war in Europe was over, but the jeep story was not finished. For even in the aftermath of victory, it would leave its mark on soldiers, on civilians, and on the world it helped to reshape. When victory came, the jeep remained. Across liberated Europe, they were everywhere, parked in ruined squares, ferrying officers to surrender ceremonies, carrying weary men home from the front. For the soldiers who had relied on them, jeeps were more than machines, they were companions. Many veterans remembered their jeep's quirks, the one that always backfired at dawn, the one missing a seat, the one held together by wire and hope. They gave them nicknames, painted their girlfriends' names on the hoods, and swore they would never forget the bond. But war's end also scattered the jeeps far and wide. Thousands were sold as surplus, snapped up by farmers, who found they were as useful in ploughed fields as in foxholes. Others were gifted to allied nations rebuilding from the ashes. In France, Holland, Italy, even the Philippines, villagers remembered the sight of the Jeep as the first sign of liberation. A French farmer once told an American officer, "There, we knew the Germans were beaten not when we saw your tanks, but when we saw your little cars. There were so many of them, they seemed endless, unstoppable." For the US Army, the Jeep became a lesson in mobility, proof that war could not be won by size alone, but by adaptability. Commanders who had once doubted it now praised it as indispensable. Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, all gave credit to the machine that had carried them forward. And in the Pacific, the Jeep continued to serve until the final surrender of Japan in August 1945. From island jungles to airstrips hacked from coral, it proved its worth one last time. By war's end, nearly 650,000 Jeeps had been built. They had served in every theatre, under every condition imaginable, and when the soldiers returned home, many carried a simple memory that no matter how dire the circumstances, they could count on a Jeep to carry them through. But the Jeep's story did not end with peace. It would inspire generations of vehicles, become a civilian icon, and live on as a symbol of resilience. Yet for those who had seen it in war, the memory was sharper, more personal. The Jeep was not just a car, it was the machine that went everywhere, carried everyone, and never stopped until the war itself was over. The German generals laughed at the Jeep. They saw it as a toy, a trinket of an inexperienced army, but history had the last word. The Jeep was never designed to terrify. It could not duel with tanks. It could not level cities. What it did was far more profound. It gave an army legs, the power to move, to adapt, to endure. It brought supplies to starving units, carried the wounded from killing grounds, and ferried hope into places where hope had nearly died. It was everywhere in every theatre with every soldier, and in the end it became not just a machine of war, but a symbol of perseverance, of an idea that strength is not always measured in size, but in resilience, adaptability, and presence. General Eisenhower once said, "The Jeep was one of the 3 decisive tools that won the war," and perhaps he was right. But ask the men who rode them, and they'll tell you something simpler. The Jeep was a friend. It carried them home. As we look back today, we remember not only the battles fought, but the spirit of endurance embodied in this little machine. In a world that often glorifies might, the Jeep reminds us that sometimes it is the humble, the underestimated, the overlooked that truly change history. This was the story of the Jeep, the machine that made an army unstoppable. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history. Together, we still keep alive the voices of courage, sacrifice, and resilience, the echoes of World War II.